How will we power our future? Can we create a healthy and clean economy? Climate One at the Commonwealth Club is at the forefront of the global debate about energy, economy, and the environment. Bringing together the brightest and most provocative leaders of our time, Climate One is the place where big ideas get heard. With thoughtful and insightful discussions on policy, business, science, and culture, Climate One founder Greg Dalton gets to the heart of the matter. It's our future. It's time to come together.
Today on Climate One, we discuss the sharing economy and the many options now available for getting around.
If the enemy is unnecessary personal vehicle ownership, then certainly the abundance of choice is not a bad thing.
Also, we talk about electric cars in California and their impact on your carbon footprint.
Our customers want to get off of oil, and they want to. It's quite a luxury feature to be able to drive past the fueling station and not have to stop and pump gas.
But first, we hear good news from the battle to reduce carbon pollution.
And it looks like we might just be entering this phase where we're decoupling the global economic system from a dependency on fossil fuels and the emissions that come with that.
Coming up on Climate One. Rebecca Shaw, you were a budding marine scientist in the late 1980s, and you were down in the Amazon and had kind of a climate epiphany. Tell us what happened.
Yeah, I was a research assistant on a project. It was after I finished my undergraduate degree at UC Santa Barbara, and I was so excited to study the natural world, and I went down there at the time when there was a burgeoning understanding of what was going on with deforestation and its effect on climate. In fact, the Time magazine that month that I went down, I'm pretty sure it was that month, had a picture of the Amazon on its cover, said the lungs of the earth, really making the point that we were actually taking away our life support system. And the Brazilian government, I was just studying the natural world down there, living on a floating raft out in the middle of the rainforest, and the Brazilian government and the state governments down there were feared for their sovereignty, and they upped the pace to settle the Amazon. And we saw the lake we were living on go from complete 100% forested to 100% deforested in the very short amount of time. And that's when I really realized that it wasn't enough to study the natural environment, but it was had to understand the natural environment and understand the social systems that were going to sustain it, both the biodiversity, but also the climate.
And the mayor handed out chainsaws?
Yeah, it was the governor of Amazonas, the state of Amazonas, and it was actually had a program where he was handing out chainsaws to the settlers so that they could go and settle the land at the time. I'm not really sure how extensive the program was, but it certainly got the attention of all of us working down there, and it really was a life-changing moment for me.
Ben Santer, you wrote a sentence in 1995, famous sentence in Climate. Tell us about that sentence and what was the consequence of writing that sentence?
Sure. In 1994, I received a phone call out of the blue and was asked to participate as a convening lead author for the Climate Change Detection and Attribution chapter of the second assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC. And I said yes, agreed to do it. 1.5 years later, after evaluating the scientific evidence, hundreds of studies, our group came to the historic conclusion that, quote, the balance of evidence suggests a discernible human influence on global climate. And I had no idea that single sentence was going to change my life profoundly and really change the world. It had significant impact in politics and science. It caused me about 1.5 years of grief defending that finding and the process by which it had been reached. But I learned a lot of important lessons. Words matter, and they can change the world.
How did it change your life?
Even that cautious sentence was too much for the Global Climate Coalition. It was sort of the end of the line, real recognition that humans were no longer simply innocent bystanders in the climate system. We were actually active participants. And unfortunately for me, I was the messenger, and a lot of powerful people didn't like that message.
And they personally attacked you?
The accusation was that I specifically was responsible for purging all scientific uncertainty from this chapter of the IPCC report. So it was a pretty serious allegation, and One gentleman circulated an email stating that I had been indicted or was about to be indicted by the Hague International Court of Justice for, quote, falsification of international scientific documents, unquote. So nothing in my scientific career had prepared me for that kind of reaction. I thought the report's published, I can go back to being a dad, to being a husband, to doing my job, but I was wrong.
Real hardball. Tim Flannery, you were in Japan with the late climate scientist Steve Schneider, and you had something of a climate epiphany. Tell us about that.
Well, I did. I'd been working for years before that in the high mountains of New Guinea, and I'd seen that the tree line was advancing on all of those mountains. And I knew that there was some sort of climate signal there, but couldn't kind of put it together in my mind what was happening. And I went to a biodiversity conference in Japan, and Steve Schneider spoke for an hour, and that totally changed my world. It put everything in context. I could see then that those alpine environments with all of their unique flora and fauna just wouldn't survive unless we did something about climate change. The mountains weren't high enough to provide a refuge for them. So that was it then for me. I just was decided I had to do something, and I thought the best thing I can do is write a book to explain it to people who perhaps don't understand it as well as I did. I was a scientist, trained scientist, and I'd missed the full importance of it. So I sat down. It took me about 4 years to go through the same literature that you would have gone through, and just to put it in simple terms for people, what this was all about. And so that was the outcome.
And that book, if that was the Weather Makers, that book came out in 2005 or so. Yeah. A lot of people have been impacted by that book.
But what's happening now is you begin to see the impacts actually becoming very real. And when the impacts are actually affecting the things we care about, our health, our safety, our food supply, or our ability to grow certain kinds of food, or even our pocketbooks, we begin to pay attention. And it's really happening in very different kinds of way across the planet.
So tell us about Cheerios and Campbell's Soup, two icons in the American supermarket and kitchens.
So we work with large corporations to help them make sustainability commitments and follow those sustainability commitments all the way down to the ground. And a few of those companies that we're working with include Walmart, Kellogg's, General Mills. They are really making amazing commitments, because one of those places we're seeing, again, climate impacts that are most severe, most quickly, are in the farming community, in our ability to produce food. And they're also making really significant commitments to water use efficiency. So as precipitation becomes more variable, we can make sure that we have sustainable water supplies and healthy food being grown for all of our needs. It's a real challenge. Food companies can't do it alone, but I see them certainly in the work that we do as some of the leaders, because this is where the pinch point is right now.
Tim Flannery, I vividly remember, I think it was 2008, when rice was rationed at Costco in California because there was an Australian drought and rice out of Australia. So what's been the impact? Are you seeing similar signs of optimism and change in the agricultural area in Australia?
Look, we certainly are. I was just speaking to Australian grape growers recently, and they told me that they had seen that the season for harvest had advanced by a month over a couple of decades. That's very significant for them. And many of them are buying land in Tasmania, which is the southernmost part of Australia, because where they grow now, it's just getting too hot. The grapes are getting sunburned, they don't have the water reliability. And bushfires are tainting the grapes with the smoke, because we're getting really mega fires in Australia now as well. So conditions are changing, and we are seeing farmers now become much more proactive about reducing emissions. We've got a fantastic institution in Australia called the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, and it's helping farmers to reduce emissions wherever it can. So if you own a piggery, you can go to the CEFC for some funding and unlock some more bank funding to put a biodigester in, so that you deal with that waste rather than just let it emit methane, which is 20 times more potent than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. So I think I'm quite optimistic about the farm sector in Australia. I think they have the capacity to change, and with a little bit of assistance, we should see some big reductions in emissions.
Rebecca Shaw, a lot of the changes that are happening are social and cultural and perhaps not so measurable. I think some people in climate conversations focus on, how much carbon did you reduce and how much energy displaced, that sort of thing. So do we think that sometimes measurement is sort of overemphasized in the social, we're talking about a social change here.
Yeah, and sometimes the kind of information that comes out just about the physical or natural science and the impacts isn't the kind of information that you and I can use to actually create change. And so what I've seen a whole lot more in the last 5 years in particular is a lot more attention on how all of us interpret that kind of information and what kind of information we need in order to create the kind of change that's going to matter at a collective level and not on an individual level. And so you see a whole lot more focus on that, and we certainly use a lot of that new science that's coming out of the social science literature and the psychology literature to really think about how we deliver our message in a much more effective way to help people who need to know understand what the natural scientists and the physical scientists are talking about.
What are some top 3 things that you suggest someone can do? Okay, all right, what do I do in my life? What do I change tomorrow?
We've got a little group in Australia called Solar Citizens who own PV panels on rooftops, solar panels on roofs. They're hardly radicals. Most of them are pensioners or people with a heavy mortgage. They're watching their budget, so they want to make sure they control their energy costs. But they've formed this group, and they now lobby in marginal electorates to say to governments, we like this stuff, we want more clean energy. And, Australia's leading the world with solar rooftop installations. About 1 in 5 Australians now benefits from solar electricity on their rooftop. So joining groups like that is really, really important. Australian Youth Climate Coalition, I think there's an American Youth Climate Coalition, is another great outlet for younger people. They use social media in ways that astonish me when I see that. So no matter what your age is or what your interest, I think joining those groups online is just really, really a powerful thing to do.
Rebecca Shaw, other things that an individual could do, any tips for people listening to this? If you already got solar panels, maybe electric car, what can people do?
What we eat and how we eat it and when we eat it is a really important driver of greenhouse gas emissions. And so if you're eating things that come from far away, they have a high carbon footprint because they had to be transported there. If it's a water intensive crop in a drought-ridden region, it's a greenhouse gas intensive food. And I think the biggest piece of it, and the thing that we can all do, is that 40% of all the food that's produced is wasted. And so just by watching that we don't waste food at restaurants, in our homes, that we're careful that what we buy we're going to consume, is a really important step forward, both in protecting, in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also saving water, that's a scarce resource, and also in maintaining biodiversity on the planet. So I think paying close attention to the food and not wasting food is a really critical piece of it.
Ben Santer, what can a person do to have an impact, individual?
Educate yourself. To me, it's that understanding of the basics of the science, the understanding of the nature and causes of climate change and likely outcomes. If we had an informed, scientifically savvy electorate, we'll be in a much better position to make wise choices on what to do about all of this.
Let's also talk about solar, which is a very real, very positive story. I think one of the most positive stories. Tim Flannery, you mentioned it earlier. You write in your book that solar costs have come down 100 times in 10 years. That's phenomenal.
It's incredible.
Is there more left to go? Solar is still only in 1% of power in the United States. Wow. So how revolutionary could this be?
It is coming down at 10% per annum. It has been doing for the last 30 years. Costs are they're very competitive now. That solar has made it to the market. Wind is a similar story. I've got a friend who invests in wind farms, and his company just signed a power purchase agreement in Texas to deliver electricity at about 4.1 cents a kilowatt hour. I mean, that was fantasy a year ago. Costs have come down so much. And I've worked with various large wind companies, and they see a total revolution happening in the next 5 years. They see containerised wind turbines, so everything comes in a shipping container, built on site. 3D printers on the blades to keep them up to scratch, so you don't need to replace the blades. Gearless wind turbines with the heads with so few moving parts that the maintenance is cut down. In the next 5 years, the cost of electricity from wind turbines is projected by these companies to be half what it is today. the cost of electricity from wind. So we are seeing a huge change in technology in these areas, and I'm absolutely confident that they are going to push fossil fuels out of the market, especially once we get battery technology down to cost as well. The trouble is the time. The transition can't happen overnight globally. So we're committed to emitting quite a lot of CO2 in the next 20, 30, maybe even 40 years.
Australia was one of the first places to put a price on carbon, but some people said it was a little bit of Swiss cheese, that it wasn't really an effective carbon tax. But tell us, is that still in place?
It was a very effective carbon tax. It reduced the amount of coal in our electricity mix from about 77% down to 72% over the 2 years it ran. But it was abolished with the sceptical government that came to power. And now we've lost all of those gains. Look, I think we could have sold the carbon tax better. I wish that the government had just cut a cheque for everyone as a sort of rebate for any additional costs that they would have faced in their electricity bills and so forth. That wasn't the way we ended up doing it. And we have the distinction now of being the only country on the planet that's gone backwards in terms of implementing a carbon price. And that needs to be addressed in our future.
Let's go to our audience question.
Richard Bailey, the Climate Museum Institute. Question for Ben Santer. Given that museums are not beholden to corporate bottom lines or government politics or things like that, they're independent, do you think a Climate Museum Education Center can have a significant change in educating the general public?
Yes, I do. And truth in advertising, my sister is Vice President for Science Content at the Miami Museum of Science. So I've interacted with her and her colleagues for many years now in terms of how one might do a better job making museums venues for allowing the public to interact and intersect with climate science. These things, for example, Climate on a Sphere, where they have rotating spheres and show the warming of the planet and simulation results. There are all kinds of opportunities for bringing the science to the public, making it alive and real and interesting. The Science Museum of Minnesota is another entity that I've been involved with on a couple of occasions, and they do a terrific job explaining what we do as scientists, why people should care about it, what likely outcomes are. I think there's a big role for museums in terms of interfacing with the public on the science.
Make it more real. Let's hope that one in Miami is not underwater before too long. Let's go to let's have our next question in Climate One. Welcome.
I was wondering how the panel would look at how in the governments of the world all seem to be interested in growth, economic growth. How can we deal with climate change and still deal with economic growth?
Tim Flannery, that's a tough one. The whole system is built, everyone's retirement plan who's listening to this is built on compounded quarterly growth.
That's right. But there was a very interesting study produced by the International Energy Agency earlier this year that said for the first time since they'd been keeping records, which is the last 40 years, they'd seen in 2014 a year in which global economic growth continued, but that emissions growth stalled. So, and it looks like we might just be entering this phase where we're decoupling the global economic system from a dependency on fossil fuels and the emissions that come with that.
And California has successfully done that for a couple of decades. California has grown its economy, grown its population, and energy and greenhouse gas output has stalled or declined. Let's go to our next audience question. Welcome to
Brian Cole. I think there's a question for you, Ms. Shah. Do you see any evidence that the corporations, companies, businesses that recognize that climate change is a threat to their business are willing to speak in an organized public and political way to counter the rhetoric of those other companies that refuse to recognize the validity of climate change?
I think that different private businesses are feeling the pinch in different ways. And you can see the food companies are concerned because of the agricultural output and its impact on that. Really, it hits their bottom line. And so they're some of the first actors. And so they were at the UN Climate Summit in 2014 to launch an initiative called the Climate Smart Agriculture, so farmers standing next to NGOs, standing next to government, standing next to corporations, saying we're going to commit to decreasing greenhouse gas emissions from agricultural production, increasing farmer incomes and livelihood, and increasing resilience and environmental outputs from agriculture. You don't want to stick your neck out there and have it left off, because there are consequences to taking bold stands. But we are seeing those who are feeling the impacts the greatest and seeing threats to their bottom line in the near term are moving more boldly, and they're moving boldly together. And whether they can impact other sectors, it's a question, but I think that you're always going to have sectors that are going to lead first, because for obvious reasons, and sectors that will drag their heels. But eventually, they are moving and they are taking bold stands.
Up next, a taxi driver and a Lyft driver square off on the new age of personal mobility. So, Joe Rodriguez, paint the picture for us here. We got a crowded city, lots of cars on the street. Is transit getting around the city and the Bay Area going to get any easier anytime soon?
Well, at least here in San Francisco, we're seeing Muni improve vastly with the new Muni Forward program. They have a 7% service improvement, which I think is one of the biggest service improvements they've had in years. We have increased service through these new ride-hail apps. Folks would fillet me alive if I said rideshare, some folks. And
he's sitting over there.
Yeah, I know, he's looking at me. He's giving me that look. And we still have our taxi system. So are things getting more crowded? Yes. If we don't continue moving forward, are many planners and many people in transportation saying we're headed for trouble? Yes. But are things moving forward? Yeah.
Moving forward slowly. Pat and Murphy, your company Get Around is partly based on the premise that there's car overpopulation. So what are you doing to address car overpopulation?
Yeah, so basically what Get Around enables you to do is if you own a car, you can basically turn it into a car share vehicle. So we have something called Get Around Connect that turns your car into a connected car. So when you're not using it, other people can use it in the same way they would a traditional car sharing vehicle. So they just download our app and they can find it, rent it, and unlock it all from the app. So while you're not using it, your car is helping pay for itself and make yourself a little bit of money. And it enables someone in your neighborhood to basically get around without having to buy another car and put it in the already, as you mentioned, overcrowded infrastructure.
Chakib, I want to ask you about, there's lots of choices for getting around these days. Isn't that a good thing for people?
Well, it's a good thing to have a lot of choices and options, and we want all of those choices will be good for the customer, for the public, to serve the community and for public safety. But we don't want to put more cars in the road, because that create pollution in our air that we breathe, and that can create asthma or some disease, and we don't want that for our community.
And so you believe that Uber, Lyft, sidecar, that's putting more cars on the road, more people inside cars. Is that right?
Well, yeah. There is a Lyft representative. He claimed that they just put tens of thousands of vehicles on the road, and that create congestion, obviously, and create air pollution.
Ozzy Arce, you're a Lyft driver. You do it full time. Do you think that Uber and Lyft are putting more cars on the road in the Bay Area?
I believe that there are being more cars put on the road, but I also believe that it is up to the passengers themselves to dictate or have better judgment on when they're going to decide to use the ride-hail app service as opposed to using the bike or having to walk.
Joe Fitzgerald Rodriguez, I want to ask you, what do we know about, what does the research say about car sharing, ride sharing, these new app-based hail services? Is it putting more cars on the road, more pollution in the air?
Research from both sides will tell you different things. As a reporter, it can be, you have to hedge a lot as you're writing, because there's folks, even today, I was just reading a filing from Uber to the California Public Utilities Commission, who are saying, hey, we take so many cars off the road, we do X, Y, and Z, we're really helping the climate. You've got to make sure that we get as many cars off the road as we are doing. But then you see the taxi folks filed a similar thing to the CPUC, which said the exact opposite. Our studies show that people who are using the ride-hail apps would have taken the bus, they would have walked, they would have biked, that they would have taken a taxi. They wouldn't necessarily have driven, so you're not taking cars off the road. You've got competing research from both sides.
If the enemy is unnecessary personal vehicle ownership, then certainly the abundance of choice is not a bad thing. And the fact that you are seeing more and more Lyft vehicles and more Uber vehicles doesn't necessarily mean that it is a net negative for pollution, right? You're looking at a higher utilization of vehicles across an increasing number of people. So you already see in these innovative ride-sharing companies, it's not my job to carry their water, but I will, they're already innovating one step further and coming out with Uber Pool and Lyft Line to put more people in those cars rather than less, so that the number of trips are actually shared by more people rather than on a one-off basis. So Get Around actually fits really well into this piece, because when we survey our folks, actually they say that the combination of public transit, ride sharing, and Get Around enabled them to live car free. So we take care of that 20 to 30% of the time when you really do need a car to go pick up some groceries or head out of town for the weekend, where public transit, bike share, or an Uber wouldn't make any sense.
How does this affect car makers? Big part of the American economy. Is that going to hurt the economy? What I hear you saying, Pat and Murphy, is fewer cars used more frequently. That spells bad news for Detroit.
The reality is we have too many cars right now in America. We have too many cars worldwide. Get Around can't exist unless people own some cars, right?
Ozzy Arce, I want to hear your story on this. You're actually not planning on being a Lyft driver forever. You have other ambitions, but this is providing a good job for you right now.
Yeah, this actually gave me a really good option in order to raise funds to be able to push myself forward through either college or now post-college.
I didn't own a car until I was 22. Did not own a car, did not even drive a car. I had to get my license then. Because it's just such an alien thing to grow up in San Francisco and need a darn car. You got Muni, you can bike, you can walk. A lot of my friends, we just walk everywhere, and it is so convenient. And San Francisco is finding it more convenient too. We're finding now that the major mode is all alternative forms, and drivers who commute are like 24% alone, and then in the carpool then make up about just under 50% of the city. So it's a trend that's moving.
Chakib Aidi, what do you want from the regulators in San Francisco? Do you want Uber and Lyft to go away? What are you asking for? What does the taxi drivers want?
Well, actually, we want them to be regulated, have the proper registration and the proper insurance for the safety of the public and the bicyclist or pedestrian. We want them to make sure that those drivers are professional, they know their way around, they pay their taxes, and they pay for the taxi stand. And we want the city to know how many number exactly are out there, because they are limited in the streets, and that creates a lot of traffic and a lot of congestion.
Joe Fitzgerald Rodriguez, there is a state law requiring $1 million insurance this summer. The state passed a law so that Uber and Lyft and Sidecar have to have $1 million commercial liability. Farmers Insurance now has a rider that people can buy as 8% to your premium if you own your car and you're doing Lyft or Uber on the side. So the insurance question is being addressed. How about some of the other concerns that the taxi?
Actually, the SFMTA, the Municipal Transportation Agency here in San Francisco, filed a litany of concerns of things that they would like to see change statewide in regulation of Uber. Among them, deeper criminal background checks. I'll tell you a quick story. Syed Musafar, the man who drove for Uber and hit that poor little girl, the 6-year-old girl, Sophia Liu, on New Year's Eve 2 years ago, and she died. When she was hit and killed and died, her family still hasn't had a payout from Uber. Syed Muzaffar also was found to have a criminal background in Florida. The police report that I obtained from Florida showed that he was driving over 100 miles an hour into oncoming traffic with his family in the back seat.
Do you ride Uber and Lyft yourself?
I ride every mode of transit in the city for research as a reporter. When I use things personally, I use Muni.
Ozzy Arce, you have studied criminal justice. Do you know whether you've got a criminal background check to drive Lyft? Did you know they did one on you?
It actually takes a good like 4 or 5 days for you to get a response back on that criminal check. I actually just referred my girlfriend about a week ago, and she's still waiting on her background check response too.
Hope it comes back okay.
Yeah, I hope so.
Let's go to our audience question. Welcome to Climate One.
Oh, thank you. I had a question regarding the medallions, because the taxis used to have, I think it was a $250,000 medallion fee, and now it seems to be rendered useless by Lyft and Uber and Sidecar. So what is the city doing to recover those taxes that are lost, and to maybe recompensate the taxi companies and taxi drivers who paid a lot of money for these medallions, and they're now basically worthless?
Interesting, Chucky. I mean, those medallions, very valuable. Are they worth less now? And I think the question was, what's the city
that's correct. Those medallions are very valuable now. Well, there is a lot of people there trying to sell their medallions they own, and a lot of people they're going out of business. And from the city there is help, but they can do better always, and there is a waiver from the A-card payment that we have, and there is always a way for improvement and help from the city, because those taxi drivers, their income have cut to 40% now, and a lot of people, they're losing their life and their work, their jobs, and their money.
That's tough. Joe Rodriguez, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's another example that taxi drivers would point to as the divide between the kind of uneven playing field between these ride-hail apps and taxis. I mean, you pay for a medallion, or you rent or lease a medallion in order to drive a taxi, whereas you just download an app and just in a few days or a week or so, you're driving for Uber and Lyft.
So you can see there is like it's not the same service that we're doing, because, I'm a professional Uber driver or Lyft driver. He cannot compete with me because I know my way around. I can get you there faster. And especially the taxi industry now is the greenest fleet in the history, or in all over the United States.
Let's have our next question. Welcome.
Being that there is only about 2,000 taxis in San Francisco, and we've got nearly 10 times as many, both Uber, Lyft, and other app services. Right now in San Francisco, you can get everything from medical weed to booze delivered in under 15 minutes. So, and all via an app. Now that requires drivers to get that done. If they're contributing nearly 2 million tons of CO2 to the air every year in San Francisco alone, how does that positively affect our city?
First of all, I didn't know you could get booze delivered in 15 minutes. Thanks for that. I was okay. All right, good news. Okay.
The trade-off you get when you get someone who's only driving a few hours every week is you get someone who doesn't necessarily have that level of experience or training. The training for Uber and Lyft usually consists mostly of videos. Lyft does offer some Lyft mentors, which is kind of a step up from Uber's offering, people who will actually take you out and teach you how to do what you need to do. But Uber, for the most part, just has kind of videos online, whereas the taxis provide about a day's worth or a week's worth of training, depending on what training you're getting. So what you're seeing, and any cop who you're talking to off the record will tell you, is, oh yeah, man, they're pulling in over here, they're pulling in over there, they're double parking here, they're double parking there. As anyone who knows about the city's fragile system of roads can tell you, is even one stalled car in a lane, a right turn lane, can make all this congestion. It ripples. It has an effect over the entire city and congestion.
Let's have our next audience question. Welcome to Climate One.
All new cabs have had to have been either hybrid or CNG since 2012. Now, Uber and Lyft don't have to wait for the city to require that. Do they have any plans, and how soon are they planning on making all their vehicles hybrid or CNG?
I don't know about Uber or Lyft's plans for hybrid vehicles, but what I do know is that their requirements for vehicles are getting stricter all the time. They're asking for newer vehicles. Those newer vehicles tend to be more fuel efficient. So that is a plus of them asking for newer and nicer vehicles and more upkept vehicles. But there's also a requirement that they're battling right now to perhaps require vehicles that have less road wear and tear, that are getting more stringent inspections, including smog inspections and other types of inspections, and they're currently in talks about how strict to make those inspections, which can affect that as well.
One last question.
Does the taxi industry have any strategies to improve their competitiveness versus these ride-sharing industry? Obviously, if there's 20,000 ride-hail drivers and 2,000 taxi drivers, the pendulum has swung pretty wide. Is there any strategy to improve value, improve quality, lower prices, something that would make taxis more competitive?
Tee up Flywheel, Chucky.
We do have the app, and you can download on your phone, Flywheel, and we are the first who invented this app, and the taxi industry have the app from a long time ago. So Uber and Lyft didn't bring anything new to the city. And there is no innovation because they claim that most of the ride for Uber and Lyft, they start and end by the public transportation station. Same for taxi. So there is no innovation in there. And we have the app, and you can download on your phone called Flywheel. We are professional driver, and the candy or chocolate, that's not a customer service.
How do you think this is all going to shake out?
Anyone listening or watching, has your life gotten better or worse since Uber and Lyft has existed? And I think the overwhelming majority of people would say, yes, it's gotten better. So the reality is that the taxi cab services weren't delivering a great product for a long time. I actually think San Francisco delivered a much better product than most cities. And the reality is that this is what the future is that we're looking at. When I get into a cab, and if I had children, and if I put them into a cab or an Uber, I know that when I get into an Uber, that there's a record of it, and that there's a record of who I was with. And to me, that's pretty reassuring.
Up ahead, electric cars and the future of transportation. Hector De La Torre, let's begin with you. Governor Brown has a aggressive plan for fighting carbon pollution in California. Transportation's a big part of that. There's lots of pieces. What's the governor doing, and how's that going right now?
Well, we have multiple venues that we're pushing to make this happen. We're doing it through reducing vehicle miles traveled and making communities more sustainable, easier to walk, bike, etc. We're doing it through a low carbon fuel standard, which is to reduce the carbon impact of the fuel itself that we're using in the vehicles. It is promoting zero emission vehicles, which is very important to what we're trying to do. Almost half of the greenhouse gas emissions are related to the use of petroleum in California. And that is the core of what we're trying to do to reduce greenhouse gases in general in the state of California. So those are a few of the strategies that we are using. Renewable fuels is another one, increasing the use of renewable fuels that are, again, less carbon intensive.
Shad Bulch, what part of that plan, Governor Brown's plan, is GM on board with? What part do you find some differences with?
Well, the administration has been very supportive of helping create the market for EVs. And that has allowed us to come out in full force and really achieve some pretty good success with the first generation Chevrolet Volt, the second generation Chevrolet Volt, which just went on sale about 3 weeks ago here, the upcoming Chevy Bolt EV concept car, which will be available at the end of next year, the Spark EV. So all of these new technologies are these plug-in cars. The success of them and the market's willingness to adopt them is really in large part due to the collaboration between the automakers, the utility stakeholders, and government.
Dearman O'Connell, how much of it is the policy supportive important for Tesla? Could you do it without this supportive policy environment?
Well, fundamentally, electric vehicles are going to be successful in the long run because it's fundamentally a better driving technology. I mean, people will, notwithstanding the zero emissions aspects of the technology, they find when they get behind the wheel of an electric vehicle, and especially ours, that it's more fun. It's a high performance vehicle. It's safer. The handling is better, and of course, it's got the zero emissions profile. So fundamentally, this is going to be driven over the long term by market forces. That having been said, especially in this early going, the policy arena is really important. Hector sits on the Air Resources Board, which administers a policy called the Zero Emissions Mandate, which was promulgated in 1992 in an attempt to get a large volume of electric vehicles on the road even 10 years ago. Unfortunately, most of the major car makers either litigated or lobbied against that mandate, softened and weakened it. And fundamentally, that's the dynamic that the governor and his staff, who, notwithstanding their great efforts, are fighting against. That is to say that the big car companies, all things being equal, would rather continue to do what they're doing. And it doesn't make them bad people to say that. It's just that they've made huge investments in internal combustion technology, and they don't have a natural incentive to make that technology obsolete. This goes back to why we started Tesla Motors in the first place, was to provide a catalyst from outside the existing industry to put the best possible expression of electric vehicle technology on the road and to inspire competition to come into that market. Happily, that's starting to take place now, but it's a slow process. And
that's changed entirely, and I have to take issue with that. I mean, if we sell more trucks and SUVs than anything right now because that's where the market demands that. That's where we make the bulk of our money. But that is changing. That is not the world of tomorrow. And if you look at the success of the Chevy Volt and the satisfactory rate of those customers, they are the most happy vehicle owners of any vehicle out there. So what that has done for Chevrolet and the brand overall is akin to what Corvette and Camaro do for the brand. It is, by all accounts, probably the most successful vehicle we've ever done. I mean, the direction of the company in Detroit has fundamentally changed. There are scientists and engineers in labs inventing things on the daily that are going to be put in vehicles that either use little gas or no gas at all. That is where we're headed.
Hector Latour, you deal with car companies. You're one of their top regulators in the country. Do you see the kind of change that Chad Balch is talking about?
It's like pulling teeth. We very much see the progress that Chad is talking about, but it is a constantly questioned, and not specific to GM, just in general.
You know, with deference to Chad, look, this is the story that we've heard out of the auto industry forever, and especially during these regulatory reviews. You can't force us to build what the public won't buy. Well, how would the public even know that this technology was available without these technology forcing regulations in the first place? So the point is that we need to make, in these early stages, we need to make the numbers high enough so that they put mass market programs on the road. Look at if you really want to understand what GM's thinking about, look at the massive investments they're making in their SUV plant in Arlington, Texas to produce Suburbans versus what they're doing for their Volt and their Bolt programs. I'll be thrilled on the day when the investments in those legacy vehicles and those large vehicles is less than going into the advanced technology vehicles from the manufacturing point.
The number one selling plug-in in the country was the Chevy Volt, the Gen 1. That is not a car that was built to meet a regulated mandate at all. So this notion that we're building these cars only to meet a regulatory requirement is just false. We're investing right now $200 million into our Orion assembly plant to build the Chevy Bolt EV. That is happening right now. We've invested $400 million so far in a battery lab in Brownstown, Michigan, which is developing the next generation batteries for the Bolt and Volt. So the investment is there.
The Bolt, from our perspective, is a game changer, just as if you would do the same thing, which is a 200-mile range, $30-something thousand car. That is a game changer in the electric vehicle marketplace. And so GM does deserve a lot of credit for bringing that car to the market. And we need more of that car in the market so people have choice.
I'd like to get Alex Bayan in here.
There is, of course, a much broader picture, which is the fact that a lot of this inefficiency in mobility is due to congestion. So even when we embrace this broader picture, the notion that we could run more efficient operations is extremely important in considering that problem. There's another interesting fact here is that people assume we can regulate. And there was a time when, yeah, maybe you could regulate how cars were sold, which cars were sold, and how a traffic light can be used to make traffic better. But we're in a time when a lot of you in the audience and us are using a third-party app built by the private sector to route ourselves, creating complete new traffic patterns that we didn't know before. There are companies in the city and in the world who are disrupting mobility on demand, the new generation taxis, and which companies are completely changing the way demand is managed. Transit, a lot of people take transit. We see emergence of transit lines that are just not even operated by the government anymore, just on demand based on people voting. So I think that this is very much part of the equation, but I think when it comes to energy efficiency for transportation, we really also have to look at the broader picture of these technologies and the notion that the government might completely lose control on how to regulate them because this is not run by the government anymore.
A few years ago, if we were having this conversation, drop-in biofuels would have been a lot of what we're talking about, cellulosic from algae and all these sorts of things. Those haven't materialized as promised. The U.S. Navy's bought a lot of them, but you can't get them on the corner anywhere in California today. Are they done, or is it just a matter of time, Hector de la Torre?
It's absolutely part of what we're doing under the low carbon fuel standard. It's a blend fuel that we have, and our target is to be at 10% by 2020. We think we can increase that as part of the governor's mandate to hit 50% reduction in petroleum by 2030. We can increase that 10% and blend in more of the biofuels.
One of the quickest and most efficient ways to reduce fuel consumption is to put these cars on a diet. The more weight you move from them, the more economically they become. So we're investing a lot of work in technology to use smart materials and mixed materials. So our engineers just invented this welding technique where you can weld aluminum to steel. So that'll allow for the car to be structurally sound, but significantly lighter. So it's technologies like that, these 8-speed transmissions that are appearing in cars from the full line trucks down to small cars. The gasoline-powered engines themselves are becoming extremely fuel efficient, shutting off half the cylinders when you don't need it, direct fuel injection and technologies like that. So we're finding real savings in a variety of different ways, aside from having to tamper with the fuel itself.
And the Ford F-150 pickup truck, often the best-selling car in America, shed 800 pounds by going aluminum, that kind of thing.
Right.
Diarmuid O'Connell, the Gigafactory, Tesla Gigafactory is going to start producing batteries in 2016.
It will, at full capacity, exceed the current capacity of the lithium-ion battery industry right now. The reason we are doing that is to facilitate the mass market program, which we'll be introducing in 2017, the Model 3 program, as we've talked about it. Really, the car that the company was set up to build. We had to proceed from a low-volume, high-price car, our Tesla Roadster, to a mid-volume, mid-price car, the car we have right now, the Model S and its variant, the Model X. But the whole company was set up to get this mass market EV, what we call the Model 3.
It's anyone who's driven an electric car, that immediate torque, it's much better, and yet it seems like a lot of the ads are about polar bears and virtue and all these kind of good things. Well, they're not about raw,
and that's a problem.
Testosterone fun.
A car is probably the second most expensive purchase a lot of us are going to make, and to try and convey a social responsibility in order to spend that kind of money on a product like that is a really hard proposition. So you got to do what sells, and that is performance and looks and the way you feel when you drive it. We now, in our Gen 2 Volt, the battery pack is 20 pounds lighter, has 94 fewer cells in it, and gives you more energy. The technology advancements that have been made over the last 5 years in battery development are pretty wild, and the rate of advancements is going to only increase going forward.
Hector de la Torre, kind of a golden age for automobiles, and yet we got this big carbon problem that we need to solve.
Absolutely, and I want to make a point. It isn't just about technology, it's also about anthropology. We're seeing the demographic shift that's taking place with millennials. If you look at the baby boomers and then the Gen X and now the millennials, each subsequent group has gotten into a car later. So baby boomers, about 75% got their license within a year of being eligible to get it. Gen Xers, about 70%. The millennials are down in the mid-50s. They are not getting their driver's license. They are not driving right out of the gate the way we did. And that has significant impacts for the auto manufacturers, all of them, in terms of how we use these vehicles. In terms of the greenhouse gas reductions I mentioned earlier, in California, about half of our GHG emissions come from either the production, the refining, or the use of petroleum. We have to reduce it. There's no way you get to the targets we have to get to without touching that, significantly touching that 50% chunk. And so we are going to continue to push on all the fronts that I mentioned, because we have to hit our targets by 2020, by 2030, by 2050.
Typically, people think that Detroit and Houston are in alignment. The oil industry and the auto industry are in close alignment. Is that still the case? And you seem. And how about utilities, which are increasingly, if you're going toward electric, another partner?
Well, if you look at the biggest product announcements that our largest brand, Chevrolet, has made over the past year and a half, they are products that use significantly less or no petroleum at all. So if you're in the oil industry, that probably would cause a second look. But that is where we're headed. I mean, we need to diversify our portfolio. Our goal is to get off of petroleum-based fuels as a primary fuel source. The cars that are the most popular for the Chevrolet brand are those that run on electricity, not oil. So I think it's pretty clear.
Do the phones ring in Detroit when stuff like that happens? Does Houston calling saying, "Hey, what are you guys doing?"
They don't scratch our back. I mean, there's no reciprocity going on at all. It's our customers want to get off of oil, and they want to. It's a quite a luxury feature to be able to drive past a fueling station and not have to stop and pump gas.
Let's go to our audience questions. Welcome to Climate One.
Hi, I'm Dana Hull. I'm actually a journalist at Bloomberg News, and this is a question for Hector. The Volkswagen diesel emissions scandal is still in its early stages. We have a lot more discovery and investigations to go through before we even get to the penalty phase. But my question is there a discussion in Sacramento as to how the fines that Volkswagen ultimately is going to have to pay to the state of California will be used? Will it be funneled to, asthma prevention or a furtherance of ZEV incentives? I mean, what's the kind of thinking as to how the fines are going to be used?
Well, there's two parts to the answer. The first part is we're not alone in this. The federal EPA and the Department of Justice are involved in this as well, because they didn't just break our law, they broke theirs. So we're partnered. If you noticed, today's announcement was in Washington, D.C. We were part of it, but it's the three of us working together. In terms of the impact in California and mitigation going forward, initial discussions have begun. But you cannot start pinning that down until you know the scale that you're talking about. Is it the first batch of vehicles that we caught? Is it now the second batch of vehicles? Is there going to be further batches of vehicles that we discover this with? And so we don't know the scale, and until we do, we are just looking at what some possibilities might be.
Let's have our next question. Welcome to Climate One.
So I'm Bill Bunnan. I own a hybrid, and it's reduced the amount of pollution I'm responsible for significantly. And it's done it with, it's paid for itself in fuel savings. It has not imposed any sorts of additional problems for me, like range anxiety or anything like that. And in spite of that, hybrid sales are an anemic percentage of the total car sales in the world. Is that something we should be worried about?
Hybrid technology has sort of been a platform upon which electric vehicles have been able to, step forward, and that's a good thing. But I think you have to ask yourself, for the mass public, does a hybrid technology, does it offer all the utility? Does it offer the performance that a pure electric vehicle might? I mean, I would submit that an electric vehicle is a much better performing vehicle, much better handling vehicle, and offers a better value proposition to the consumer. And that's why I say, at the end of the day, this technology will win because it's a better technology. It's a better driving technology. You can do more interesting things with the platform. And hybrid it's transitional, and it's had its benefits, but I wouldn't be surprised if it doesn't achieve significant market share, especially in the face of the technologies that are coming forward.
Let's go to our next question. Welcome.
So we all probably know that electric vehicles are only clean if you're getting energy from a clean source. So big problems in infrastructure and being able to create that energy. Is there anything that the manufacturers are doing to help excel that right now.
So if you're in a coal state, your EV car, dear O'Connell, could be dirtier than a gasoline car.
Yeah, not really. It's certainly not as clean, but it's cleaner generally speaking than petroleum-driven vehicles in its class. That's number one. Number two, what we are doing, to answer your question directly, is we've taken the battery technology we've developed for the vehicle and we're repackaging it for energy storage, energy storage gives you the ability to basically store generated energy, ideally renewable energy, so solar and wind and so forth, that's generated by day or during intermittent periods with wind, to store it for the time when you want to use it. So it breaks down the traditional linkage between when you're making energy and when you're generating power and when you're using energy. So that we think that with energy storage, as we're producing it both for the residential market as well as for the commercial industrial, as well as and right up to utility scale, that really links the whole thing together. Because if you've got solar and wind on this hand, if you've got the ability to store it and use it when you need it on the other, and an electric vehicle, then you can be essentially a net zero enterprise. I have a house like this myself right now, and so I've essentially decoupled myself from the grid.
So our next question.
I'm with the firm Energy, but I used to be responsible for climate policy in Switzerland for 10 years. And so for me, when I come to a discussion like this, I always hear it's all about cars, right? And so I wanted to ask you all, when you think about electric vehicles in the bigger picture, how does the car part of it fit in with like the public transit part of it and the electric bicycle part of it in terms of overall productivity of the transit system?
Shad Bolt, you actually...
Yes, so I appreciate you bringing up electric bikes. So as part of our business update at the 1st of October, our CEO announced that she's putting in development a electric bike that we'll be selling. So it's a prototype right now, but it's just an example of the bigger picture mentality that we are looking at.
Hector De La Torre.
And clearly today's panel is about the personal vehicle, but at CARB we are looking at goods movement, for example. How do we clean up goods movement?
So that means trucks and ships?
Trucks, ships, airplanes down the road. But the idea is, what we know is that diesel it has over 80% of the cancer-causing effects of air pollution. We have to deal with diesel in California. It obviously has GHGs, but it also has this cancer-causing impact. So goods movement is a significant push. Transit, we are promoting and pushing for electric buses or hydrogen fuel cell buses or whatever we can get the manufacturers to produce and roll out here in California. So we are looking at the full range of mobility, not just personal vehicles.